As we discussed last week, during the last one-third of the 1800s, the United States went through what's called the Gilded Age. And during that period, everything changed. And the United States became the economic superpower, and it was good for the country overall. However, for individuals living in that period, it was really difficult, and it was really difficult for a majority of the population. So, during this period, there will be a lot of people that will protest and point out that the Gilded Age is not working out for not just a big part of the population, but a majority of Americans at the time. And we will look at two groups that make up the majority of of the people that were protesting: labor and agriculture. But an important concept you must know is during this period, a lot of ideas were inspired by Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto. Now, Communist Manifesto is one of the most important political documents in all of human history. And it's not important because everything he said is right, because Marx was not right by about a lot of things, but it is explain why it's so important in just a minute. First, let's look at some of the key points. This is a very, very oversimplification, but these are some of the key ideas that Marx referred to, and Marx talked about. First and foremost, he said all of history is a class struggle between the owners of the means of production, the bourgeois, and the workers, the proletariat. So throughout most of human history, that is just accurate. A small group of individuals that control the means of production, which throughout most of history, that's land, oppress the majority of the population. And that is a very common feature. That is what every monarch in history is. So he was right about that. In a capitalist system, the bourgeois will exploit the proletariat. And it's really important to remember that he is writing from Germany. He's a German political philosopher, because the Second Industrial Revolution was strongest in two places, Germany and the United States. So he is seeing in Germany a lot of the same things that is happening in the United States. So he is seeing the exploitation of workers, these huge corporations that are just completely dominating. Third, class struggles end with revolution when the proletariat rise up to power against the bourgeois. So these class struggles, they will end in revolution because poor people, they get very sick of being poor. And that is historically accurate. Revolutions where poor people rise up, poor and middle class people rise up against the really rich, is just such a common occurrence in human history. Russian Revolution, French Revolution, Chinese Revolution, Vietnamese Revolution, just everywhere. That is the norm, is poor people rising up because they're sick of being poor. And his final point that we're going to talk about, capitalism will end with social ownership of the means of production and distribution. And you must know this. That is the definition of socialism. People get this confused a lot, or a lot of people just don't know what socialism is, and they call regulation socialism. That's not socialism. Socialism is government ownership of the means of production and distribution. So it's the federal government taking over. So for example, if Joe Biden said, Walmart and Target are so fundamental to the United States, we're going to take them over and run them for the federal government, that is socialism. Regulation of a company, that is not socialism. So it is government ownership. Make sure you know that. Outside of this class, you can use it as incorrectly as you want, but in this class, it means government ownership of the means of production and distribution. So, Marx, there were a lot of things that were not correct. There were a lot of things that just historically were correct. But this undoubtedly is one of the most important political manuscripts in all of human history. And it's important for two reasons. One, it reflected the time. He is accurately writing about some of the things he is seeing in Germany with the Second Industrial Revolution. So it is a very good observation. And the second reason it's so important is because he put forth ideas that people had not thought of before. He put forth ideas that were completely novel, like the idea that capitalism will inevitably end with the majority of the population, the proletariat, rising up and taking over the companies through the government. That is socialism. So that is putting a brand new idea in people's head that a lot of people hadn't thought of before, and it will influence especially labor unions, especially in Europe. Not as much in the United States, but it is really important in Europe. Make sure you understand, though, people also get this wrong about socialism. They think like anything. So let's say hypothetically the government takes over an industry, that all of a sudden the country is socialist. And if that was the definition of socialism, then the United States is already a socialist country. Air traffic control is completely controlled by the federal government. Medicare, that is socialized health insurance for the elderly. So we have aspects that are socialism, but we are obviously not a socialist country. So it's not like socialism, yes, no. It's more like there are varying degrees of it, but it is government ownership of the means of production and distribution. And you don't have to memorize this, but for our purposes, we are going to be talking about the U.S. political spectrum in a very simple way. This isn't totally accurate, but it's a very, for our purposes, it's useful. So, last time in the Gilded Age, what we talked about, the dominant philosophy is laissez-faire, or libertarianism. And that means no government. If you talk to a true libertarian and you go issue by issue, their basic position on almost everything is just no government, no government, no government. That is their position on almost everything. Socialism is kind of the exact opposite. Well, have the government take it over. So those two are kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum. Socialism and laissez-faire. Now, Marx, while he said something's right, he was very wrong about several things. First and foremost, he saw it as workers all banding together, uniting, and overthrowing these horrible businesses. And as we talked about last time, corporations aren't good or bad. And the same thing is true for workers. The idea that the working class, the proletariat, are inherently good and going to work together, that is just factually incorrect. When we have examples of revolutions where the proletariat get together, they rise up, and they overthrow a government, they overthrow a government or business or whatever it is, do they take it over and then run it equally for everyone where everyone's treated well? No. One or two individuals will take it over and then they become the new autocrats or authoritarians. It's the working class is no better and no worse than the really rich. So that's one thing he got wrong. And it's easy to feel a lot of sympathy for workers during this period because they have absolutely no power and they're treated like crap. So they have no protections. There's no law stopping from abusing them. And they just have absolutely no power. So during the Gilded Age, it is very easy to be sympathetic to their cause. Later on, when they do get more power, labor unions can be just as corrupt as businesses. So it's more about a timing thing. What period are you looking at? How much power do they have? And during the Gilded Age, they have absolutely no power. But Marx's idea that they are just inherently good and noble and honest, history does not show that. The other thing Marx got wrong, and this is important to know, socialism has never worked. And I'm not saying that it will never work and it can never work, but we don't have any example in history of a truly socialist country that is effective long term. They will have periods where they will work, and this is true in both, like the Soviet Union, two best examples, Soviet Union and China currently. We have examples of them working for periods of time, but long term, we have no example of a socialist government that is effective. And realistically, actually, they're not even true socialist governments. They're just authoritarian dictatorships. Like North Korea calls itself a socialist country, and obviously the majority of the population is impoverished. China, it's not like everyone has equal power. It's controlled by, well, just one guy right now, but one party, and it's a very unequal society still. So they end up being just different forms of authoritarian, really. So socialism, we have no examples of it working. Someone tells you, like, we should be socialist, show me an example. But the same thing is true of libertarianism. There is no example of a libertarian government that is effective. We have, people talk about it in theory, and in theory I can understand what they're saying, but there is not an example of it working. There are plenty of examples of it not working. Libertarian government, that is also called a confederation. A confederation that is a loose coalition of a bunch of political entities that retain most of their power. So the federal system, or the central government over them, has very, very little power. That is a laissez-faire system. The basic purpose of the government is national security, and besides that, it doesn't do anything. And we have examples of Confederate governments that were just complete failures. Articles of Confederation, the first government of the first Constitution of the United States, it was an unmitigated failure. And that because the federal government had no power. Confederate States of America, the attempt to secede from the Union, one problem with the government was it was too weak. The European Union, it is no central system, central authority. It's united by a currency, essentially, and trade. But it is, there's a lot of examples of ineffective libertarian governments. I have yet to see a concrete example of here is a libertarian government or here is a socialist government that has worked long term. So that is important to know, is that Marx, his work is just one of the most influential. Long term, it has had a tremendous amount of influence in the world. And he got some things wrong, but one thing he got very right is that during the Gilded Age, workers were treated terribly. and they were treated really terribly. Now, workers, their fundamental problem is there's too many of them. There are way too many workers, and so they can be treated any way the company wants, because all the company has to do is look outside and there's tons of people that want a job. So their basic problem is there's too many of them. And if they're going to be treated better, there's only one way they can do that, and that is to organize. So labor unions have to organize in order to get anything done, but they have a lot of problems organizing for all sorts of reasons, but three big ones. First, would they organize? And it seems like a simple question, but it actually was kind of difficult because there are two basic kinds of workers: skilled workers that cannot be replaced easily, which are the minority, and unskilled workers, who can be replaced easily, and that's the majority. Skilled workers, obviously, they have more power because they can't be replaced by just anyone. And also, they're elitist, and humans like to feel good about themselves. That's one thing that unites all humans. And so they quite often would form their own unions and only allow skilled workers. And those are called trade or craft unions. Trade and craft unions only allow skilled workers. The other kind of union is an industrial union. And this is a union of everyone in an entire industry, so both skilled and unskilled. So it's not just unskilled, it is everyone in an entire industry, skilled and unskilled. The benefit of a trade or craft union is they have more bargaining power, because no company can just fire all the skilled workers. Companies can't just fire all the skilled workers, or they would go through a long period of not being able to function. The benefit of industrial unions is it's just much bigger, and it's inherently going to be bigger. So workers, though, were divided over that issue, and they would have problems organizing just because of figuring out who to allow into their union. Second problem unions had was figuring out what their objective was. Were they going to support capitalism and work within the capitalist system, in which their objective then is getting better pay, less working hours, better working conditions? Or are they going to support something very radical like socialism? Government ownership means production distribution. Socialism was especially prominent in Europe, and there will be some calls for socialism in the United States, some very important ones, but it was never quite as big as in Europe. But that difference will divide unions. Some unions will break up just over debating which system they're going to support. The final problem is they just have a lot of opposition. As a general rule, as a generalization I should say, the public generally supports workers, rhetorically. If you ask people back then, even, do you support workers? Most people say, yes, I support workers. Even today, people will say, I support workers. The problem comes in when unions have one major tool they can fight with, and that is a strike, where they stop working. The reason the public turns against unions is because they go on strike. And so it's easy to say, yes, I support workers, and then all of a sudden they go on strike, and then that starts affecting the public, like teacher strikes, for example. The majority of the population will say, I support teachers. As soon as the teachers go on strike, then all of a sudden parents have to figure out what they're going to do with their kids while they're at work, and it pisses them off. Trash collectors go on strike, and all of a sudden trash starts piling up. So the public supports workers, but as soon as they go on strike, then they tend to lose a lot of support from the public. Also, when strikes become violent, generally speaking, the public blames unions, usually. The other and the bigger problem is opposition by the government. And this isn't just the federal government, this is federal government and state governments and local governments. Governments opposed unions, and that is that is overwhelmingly totally true in the Gilded Age especially. Why would the government oppose unions? Well, for one, the whole laissez-faire thing, but two, and more importantly, who controlled the government? In the Gilded Age, it was the businesses. Businesses naturally dislike unions. So the government overwhelmingly will come down on the side of business. So obviously business doesn't like unions, and since business controlled the government during the Gilded Age, that means the government, which means the military, does not like unions. So there were a lot of hurdles to overcome. So workers had a very hard time forming unions, and they will have a tremendous amount of difficulty, and there are several unions that are formed. Most long-term successful was the AFL, American Federation of Labor. But while they were able to have some successes in organizing, they had almost no success in striking and actually getting, winning strikes against companies. And during the Gilded Age, there are tons of examples. There are tons of examples, like the Great Railroad Strike. Make sure to read that in the textbook. And the one of the most important in U.S. history, and the one you absolutely need to know for both your quiz and your writing assignment, is the Pullman Strike. This is one of the most important strikes in all of U.S. history, and so you absolutely must know this one. The Pullman Strike involved a guy named George Pullman. He is the inventor of what's called a Pullman car. These are very high-end rail cars for very wealthy people. So it's very luxurious. Like when you see movies of a rail car that has like the bar in it and the nice suede couches, and it's very, very high end. That's a Pullman car. He created them. Now he didn't sell them though. He only leased them, or he'd rent them out to people. So he wanted to make sure he maintained control of it. So he leased them out. So he controlled them, and he controlled everyone that worked on them. So that was so he could maintain control of it. And he was so wealthy, he did so well, that he was able to make his own town called the town of Pullman. Town of Pullman, it's outside Chicago. It's a suburb outside of Chicago. And in Pullman, he owned everything. And I mean everything. And he made all the rules. So he owned everyone's... If you worked for Pullman, you had to live in his town. There was no choice. You had to live in his town. You had to live in one of his apartments. And you could only rent. There was no option to buy in the future. So Pullman owns everything. He owned the stores, he owned the houses, he owned the churches. And you had to live there, and you had to pay him rent. So they even went so far as they would take the rent out of your paycheck. So the average worker, Pullman, made about $14 a week, or $14 every 2 weeks. And rent would be about $8. And so you would get a paycheck for every 2 weeks for $6. Again, workers had no option. And they had to live there, it was automatically taken out. And he had some very, very strict rules too. Like, there is no drinking allowed in the entire town. The only place you could have alcohol was the hotel, and most of the workers weren't allowed in the hotel. Some managers were. But they had to buy from his store because it was too far to go to a city. They had to buy electricity from him. They had to buy gas from him to heat their homes. And there is a very strict no union policy in Pullman. So they even controlled how long or how many people could organize, or if they could organize, or if groups could get together. So you're not even allowed to get together with a bunch of friends. And you have no political voice. He is essentially the dictator of town, and workers couldn't vote or anything. And I've had people say, well, that's just good business. Just so you know, this is what a monarchy looks like. This is what a feudal system looks like. This is we'll come back to this, but it's insanely un-American. Now, workers were already struggling, obviously. It was difficult. It was very difficult working for this Pullman. And then the financial panic of 1893 happened. The panic of 1893, it was the worst economic collapse in U.S. history to that time. As the United States has gotten more advanced, economic collapses get worse and worse and worse. And the panic of 1893 was so bad that it's called the Great Depression until we get to the Great Depression. When the panic happened, Pullman fired half of all employees. So there was about 5,800 employees. He fired about 3,000 of them. So more than half of all workers. And the ones that stayed on, he cut their pay by between 25 and 40%. So all the workers that got to stay on got to keep their jobs, they had their pay cut so much that, for months and months, after they still had to live in his town, they still had to pay the same prices for the utilities, they still had to pay the same prices for the food, but now their pay is cut 25 to 40%. So there were a lot of workers that after they deducted the pay for rent would get a check for 3 cents. That is 3 cents every 2 weeks. That is, even back then, that is not enough to live on. It got to be so bad that a lot of workers, they couldn't afford gas, electricity, clothes, or anything like that. And Chicago gets very cold, so their kids couldn't go to school even. There were a lot of instances of kids that the parents could not afford to heat the house, and they couldn't afford to pay for them to have clothes to go to school, so the kids would stay in bed with all the blankets over them all day, for days on end. When you get into the details of how bad this was, it was much worse than you think it was. So the workers, they decided that they needed to go and talk to management. They were living in such bad conditions that they got together and said, all right, we need to go tell them how bad this is. And what they were wanting was to decrease the price of rent or decrease the price of goods in the stores, decrease the price of utilities. So they sent 3 workers to go to speak to management. And when those 3 workers got there and started saying the problems they were experiencing, they were fired on the spot. When those 3 workers were fired, the rest of the workers at Pullman went on strike. Now, the Pullman workers caught a break here. They caught a break here because just 1 year before, the largest, or the very first industrial union was created. And remember, industrial unions are unions that involve everyone in an entire industry. It was called the American Railway Union, and it was everyone that dealt with railroads. The founder of it, and you need to know this guy, Eugene V. Debs. Debs heard what was happening in Pullman. He talked to some people, workers from Pullman, and he said, the ARU has your back. Debs tried to go negotiate with Pullman through as the head of the ARU and as representative of the people of Pullman. And when he did this, Pullman would have nothing, or he refused to speak to Debs. He refused to acknowledge the ARU. So Debs and the ARU, which is around 250,000 members, so everyone in the railroad industry, boycotted working on Pullman cars. So now, any train with a Pullman car attached, the members of the ARU, so all railroad workers, refused to work on that train. So this is essentially all trains. Well, not all trains, but it was when they stopped working on any train that had a Pullman car, it shut down all railroads basically in the western half of the United States. Everything west of Detroit, 27 states just completely shut down. They completely shut down. The U.S. economy just froze. Even today, if we stopped railroads, if railroads stopped running, then it would basically just, it would shut our economy down. So the economy is essentially paralyzed. Now, Pullman, working with people from the federal government, came up with an idea. They started attaching postal cars to the trains that also had Pullman cars. So you have a train, they had a Pullman car, and then they would attach a car for the U.S. Postal Service. Why is this such a good idea? Because now the strikers, because they're not working on the Pullman cars, which are also connected to the post office cars, which that is part of the federal government, now the strikers they're stopping federal government from performing its actions. They're interfering with federal responsibility. That is a crime. That is a felony. Cannot interfere with the federal government performing its duties. That is one of the large January 6th. A lot of people that have gone to jail. It's because they're interfering with the federal government performing its action. And so now, all of a sudden, the federal government is now completely behind Pullman. And the reason is because the strikers are interfering with the federal mail system. So the U.S. Attorney General, it's like the lawyer for the United States, he sent in about 4,000 deputies to keep the train running and sent in the U.S. military. So Grover Cleveland was president and sent in about 12,000 troops all throughout the country. A lot of them went to Chicago. Soldiers went to Chicago, and there was pitched battles in Chicago where they had they created things to hide behind, to shoot. Chicago looked like a battlefield between strikers and federal soldiers. In the end, 30 or 40 strikers were killed in Chicago alone. The Attorney General then went to the U.S. Supreme Court and asked for an injunction. An injunction is the court saying, in this case, that the strikers had to stop striking, and ARU and its leaders couldn't even talk about it. And this is really important to know. What is the basis for the court ruling for an injunction? If you remember last lecture, the Sherman Antitrust Act, that law passed to essentially stop monopolies. It was passed to stop business monopolies. But if you remember the actual text of it, it said anything, quote, in restraint of trade or commerce is illegal. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is passed, it's supposed to be aimed at businesses, but Sherman Antitrust Act ended up being the basis for the courts to rule the injunction against the ARU and the strike. This is the very first time it's used. So the very first time Sherman Antitrust Act is used is not against businesses, which it was supposed to be, or monopolies, which it was supposed to be used against. It was against strikers. Because if you think about it, in restraint of trade or commerce, isn't that what the strike is? It is restraining trade and commerce, so technically that is accurate. So this is the very first time Sherman Antitrust Act will be used, and it essentially just ends the strike. It even said Eugene V. or any leader of the strike that speaks about the strike will go to jail, will be arrested. Now, this is insanely unconstitutional, but Debs, he didn't stop talking about it, so Debs will end up going to jail. Debs went to jail because he kept talking about the strike against the injunction. The U.S. military was sent all over the country, and they will force railroad workers back to work at bayonet point. So ultimately, the strike was completely lost. The ARU, American Railway Union, was destroyed, and Debs wound up in jail. And all those strikers will be forced back to work at gunpoint. The Pullman strike is one of the most important strikes in all of U.S. history. And it was a massive, massive event that essentially shut down the U.S. economy for months. Even at the time, Grover Cleveland realized that the U.S. government had overstepped. I mean, the force with which the U.S. government came down against the strikers with those battles and everything, even at the time, they realized they had gone too far. Also, Cleveland said that the town of Pullman is the most un-American thing he knew of. The town of Pullman didn't cease to exist, but it will become private. Like they will get rid of a lot of those rules that were so insane. So the town of Pullman will lose a lot, Pullman will lose his power over the town of Pullman, because again, it's just insanely un-American. Another significance of this is the reason for Labor Day. That one day of year where you get a day off and you think, I have no idea why I'm getting this day off, but whatever, sounds good. It's because of the Pullman strike. Grover Cleveland, realizing what an overstep this was, realizing how bad it looked, was like, well, let's give workers a day. And so they gave workers a day, and, that solved all the workers' problems, of course. So this is directly where Labor Day comes from, because it is the government's acknowledgement, essentially, that they went pretty far. And the most important significance of the Pullman strike, though, is Eugene V. Debs ended up in jail. And from jail, he will come to the conclusion that in the United States, in a capitalist system, workers cannot get a fair strike. I just gave you one example, but there are hundreds of examples of workers going on strike and the government, whether the state government, federal government, coming in with its military and putting down the strike by force, because the government is completely on the side of business. So Debs will come to the conclusion that capitalism cannot work. There's no way a capitalist system can work because it will always oppress the workers on the side of the business. So he will form the Socialist Party of America. This is exactly like Marx had said. When workers are oppressed too much, eventually they get so sick of it that they will call for something very radical, which is undoing capitalism. So the Pullman strike leads directly to Debs becoming the founder of the Socialist Party of America, the most important socialist party in U.S. history. And Debs will run for president 5 times, and at his peak he will get 1 million members, which is a lot of people that believe capitalism has completely failed. So overall, workers had a very hard time organizing, but they were able to create labor unions. However, and this is really important to understand, just because labor unions are formed does not mean workers are going to be treated better. The question is not, are labor unions good or bad? The question is, do workers have any rights? And if workers are going to have any rights, then they have to organize. If they organize, that doesn't mean that they necessarily are going to be treated better. That means now they have the opportunity to actually negotiate, because without unionization, they can't even negotiate. So workers have absolutely no power. With unions, they then have the power to negotiate, but it doesn't mean, as we saw just now, and as there's hundreds of examples, it doesn't mean they can succeed. So workers feeling like they are being mistreated and not getting a fair shake from the government will lead directly to the creation of the Socialist Party of America.